Xi Jinping is formally appointed for a third term as China's president. All powerful at home, he faces big challenges elsewhere, up against the US in a more polarized world. So, what will be the impact of Xi's third term in China and abroad? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. Xi Jinping has been appointed for an unprecedented third term as China's president. Now, it may be a ceremonial position, but the man who holds it is by far the most powerful person in the country after he was reaffirmed as head of the Communist Party and the military last year. Following the lifting of strict COVID-19 measures, he appears to face little opposition at home. Overseas, though, relations with the US continue to decline, and tensions persist with the EU over Russia and Ukraine. So, what impact will Xi's unchallenged leadership have for China and the rest of the world? We'll be discussing all of that with our guests in just a few moments. But first, Katrina Yu reports from Beijing on what Xi Jinping faces at home and abroad.
Xi Jinping has just been re-elected as president and will begin his historic third term in office with a new leadership team behind him. But they face many challenges both at home and abroad. At home, the issue of the environment is still there. It's still a problem. As you can see behind me, Beijing has been blanketed in intense smog this week. There's also a sandstorm today on Friday. But an even bigger focus for the government is the slowing economy. They set at the beginning of the NPC a target of 5% for the year 2023, the lowest target that we've seen in decades. And that's because China is still struggling to recover from almost 3 years of its strict zero COVID policy, where consumer spending took a hit, as well as investment. We've also seen a rising unemployment rate, especially among the youth, and an ailing property sector. At home as well, President Xi Jinping's leadership, at least confidence in his leadership, also took a hit. We saw unprecedented protests take place at the end of the year, and also discontent, murmuring discontent around the hasty reversal of those strict pandemic policies. Yet analysts say that that does not seem to have created a significant dent in his power going forward. He does seem secure, but he does need to look also abroad and the growing challenges there. He said on Monday that Western countries, led by the United States, have encircled and suppressed China, creating unprecedented and severe challenges for China's development. He is referring to some of these sanctions placed by the United States targeting Chinese firms, which are really hurting not only China's technology industry, but also its access to the global market. Internationally, China also has problems with its public image since its continuing support of Russia, since its invasion of Ukraine. That's also not won China any extra fans, and China needs to really work hard to maintain its relationship with Europe and other important trading partners. And it's doing this all the while trying to protect and secure its position geopolitically, its own global security in its own backyard, and its own interests, in particular in regard to Taiwan, a self-ruled island that Beijing considers its own. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera for Inside Story in Beijing.
So let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. Andy Mock is a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. He joins us via Skype from Beijing. In Washington, D.C. is Shirley Yu. She's a senior fellow with the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. And via Skype from Hamburg is Adrian Geiges. He's co-author of the book Xi Jinping, the most powerful man in the world. A warm welcome to all of you. Adrian, let's start with you. The most powerful man in the world. I thought that moniker belonged to the US president. Why did you give your book that title? Is he the world's most powerful man?
Yes, he absolutely is the world's most powerful man. And the events today have confirmed this, because he has such a power now in China first, like nobody since Mao Zedong. But more important, China is economically so powerful nowadays that which is different from the Mao time, of course, which makes him really the most powerful man. Also because, I mean, the president of the United States, who was considered to be the most powerful person in the past, the US are so divided politically. We don't know what happens after the first term of Joe Biden. Yes, I'm absolutely sure Xi Jinping is the most powerful man in the world.
Shirley, confirmation of his third term was widely expected. To what extent, though, are the next few days more important with the appointment of a new premier and various other ministers?
Absolutely. This is essentially a continuum of the Chinese policy directions that we have seen since 2022, but more broadly, since the onset of the trade war in 2018. So we have seen a series of government reforms. We see re-centralization of power from the bureaucracy, the government side, to the party side, and the restructuring of power from the ministerial level up to the cabinet level and even up to Mr. Xi himself, but also in this congressional session and into the next 5 years, we're going to continue to see the state sector playing a pillaring role within the Chinese economy. The state sector permeates through all Chinese private sectors. And so Mr. Li Qiang, as the incoming premier, most likely has a huge job on his shoulder, and he's going to steer the Chinese economy towards possibly a new direction today faced with mounting domestic and international challenges.
Andy, as Shirley said there, Li Qiang is widely expected to replace the outgoing premier, Li Keqing. What's his relationship with President Xi? How will things differ with him in the role compared to his predecessor?
Well, I think we can expect some significant differences. One, of course, because there's a new person in the job, but also, as Shirley alluded to, there are some important structural reforms going on as well, not only within the government to emphasize science and technology, intellectual property protection, data as a factor of production, but also there's a greater integration between the party and the government. So for those two reasons, I think we can expect some meaningful changes in the role of the premier, in the role of the state council, and the role of the government. But we also have to recognize, too, that, again, because of the leading role of the CPC, that Li Qiang is also number two after Xi Jinping on the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the highest level of leadership at the party. So I think for these reasons, and of course his decades-long close relationship, working very closely with Xi, could mean that there is much greater efficiency and effectiveness going forward.
Adrian, would you agree with that? What is it about Li Qiang that will be different as far as President Xi is concerned from Li Keqing?
I mean, we have to see what he has done in the past. I mean, as already mentioned, he always was very close to Xi Jinping. That might be an advantage for him to do something more independently. But we have to see what he has done in the past. He was party chief in Shanghai in the time of the harshest lockdown in Shanghai. So he did not use his good relation to Xi Jinping to tell him, oh, this is too much, this will cause a big problems for the people and big problems for the economy. He did not do this, but he followed 100% the line of Xi Jinping. So far, I would say there is no sign that he would do something independent from Xi Jinping. Quite opposite, he will follow him in everything from what we have seen so far.
So, Adrian, surrounded now as he is by loyalists, is Xi going to get the kind of fearless and frank advice that a man in his position would surely need?
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. I mean, Xi Jinping has surrounded himself now with yes-sayers. And the problem is also with the cult of personality around Xi Jinping in China, that it's very difficult for anybody in the party to stand up against him, because, I mean, he is in the party constitution, he is in the constitution of the country, he is shown in the propaganda as the savior of China. So that would be very difficult for the party to explain if they would change something. So I think for the time being, Xi Jinping is very much in power and surrounded by loyalists.
Shirley, Xi's reappointment as head of state then comes at a particularly sensitive time for China's relations with the world. What are we to make of Xi's explicit criticism of the US this week as the leader of a Western effort to contain China, he was saying?
So President Xi has openly talked about a all-out U.S. effort to contain, encircle, and suppress China. And I think this is the first time we heard a deliberate and with succinct clarity, a Chinese vision of the current U.S.-China relations. And I think from the Chinese perspective, there is a fundamental miscalculation and misunderstanding between the U.S. and China about the strategic rivalry between the world's two largest economies today. The U.S. has talked about sanctioning Chinese technology, banning Chinese investments, et cetera. It's essentially out of national security reasons. But that understanding of national security is also preemptive. In other words, a Chinese company, a technology company, doesn't have to necessarily impose an ongoing national security threat to the United States in order to justify that. The U.S. believes that any Chinese company, either state or private, can pose a national security threat at the command of the Chinese Communist Party. So that understanding of national security threat is categorical. But on the Chinese side, the Chinese outrightly rejects that whole notion. China believes that, according to the new Chinese Foreign Minister, Qin, he recently stated that it's not about competition that motivates all U.S.'s China policies today. It is about victory. It's winning the competition that motivates all China policies. And so from Chinese perspective, this competition, as long as China continues to rise and continues to come to economic parity with the United States, this containment, encirclement, and the suppression of China, according to President Xi himself, is inevitable.
Talking about winning the competition, Shirley, to what extent does that extend to diplomacy? Iran and Saudi Arabia have announced that they're resuming diplomatic relations and embassies after talks held in Beijing. What are we to make of that? To what extent is that a slap in the face for the US?
I think outside of the United States, 80% of the world, mostly the global south today, do not wish to enter into this global geopolitical divide. And so the fundamental global understanding of the North-South divide, which we as economists have been so accustomed to in the past decades, that's passé. Today, the fundamental global divide is really the East and West divide. And unfortunately, global countries are being forced that once, the proposition, the value proposition is that you either stay with democracy or you support autocracy, and you either work with the U.S. technology or you work with the Chinese technology. So when these choices become so moral and so mutually exclusive, unfortunately, all developing worlds, all the other 80% of the global world are entangled in this geopolitical strife. But there are wise leaders out there. And I would say if we look at countries like Singapore, that's absolutely an amazing model of strategic autonomy. And I think, a lot of European countries are trying to perform a role of a mediating role within this global greater architecture as well. And countries in the Middle East are obviously seeking their strategic interests as well.
Andy, what are your thoughts on that then? The fact that these talks were brokered by China with the help of Oman and Kuwait, of course, who hosted preliminary talks, but the deal was signed there in Beijing.
Well, I think certainly China is playing a much more important role on the global stage. But I want to briefly, if I may, go back to this earlier point about Xi Jinping surrounding himself with quote unquote loyalists. I want to say that briefly, first of all, I think no leader of a large, complex organization, especially a country as challenging as China, can rise up through the ranks to the apex of political leadership without accurate information and sound judgment. And I think these people are loyalists, of course, not because not only that they've demonstrated their loyalty to Xi, but they've also demonstrated their competence as well. And I think that sometimes is underappreciated in some of the narrative in the West about this. The second point I think it's important to mention that's related to China's diplomatic efforts is that even though Xi is seen as a very powerful leader, one of the hallmarks of the Chinese system is no decision without debate and no debate after decisions. So I think the optics, of course, it looks like Xi is in charge, making all the decisions. But I think a lot of thought, a lot of debate does go into especially important decisions. And as a result of that, we've seen, I think, a very good track record over the last 10 years, over the last decades of economic reform, where China largely has made the right decisions and implemented them effectively. And increasingly, it's taking that competence and that ability to have an impact on the global stage.
Andy, I'll come back to you in just a moment, but I just want to get Adrian's thoughts on what you were saying there, and Adrian, on this deal signed in Beijing to normalize relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I mean, that shows the growing power of China in the world. And I also would agree, of course, these people are not incompetent. They are no idiots. They select good people. But still, the point is that the atmosphere we have now in China, because now, I mean, it was a big lesson of the Mao time when reform and opening up was started to say the power should not be concentrated in the hand of one person. And that's also why one person should be maximum 10 years in power. And so we have seen now at the 20th Party Congress and now today at the National People's Congress that Xi Jinping continues in power. And that creates an atmosphere which makes it difficult to discuss with him controversial topics, because everybody has to be afraid, like to become a victim of the anti-corruption campaign, which, as we know, is not only an anti-corruption campaign, but only a campaign against everybody who does not agree to Xi Jinping, and to the point that they always have wise decisions. I mean, they had this in general in the last decades, yes, but this was more also related to the opening up and reform which Deng Xiaoping started. But if we look at the very last years, I wouldn't say that the zero COVID policy, how it was implemented in China, was a wise decision. I think it was terrible for the economy and terrible for the Chinese people.
Andy, back to you. Russia's President Vladimir Putin congratulated Xi, hailing his personal contribution to strengthening the two countries' comprehensive partnership and looking forward to further fruitful Russian-Chinese cooperation. How important is Russia to President Xi right now, given the state, especially, of the relationship with the US?
Well, I think Russia is important to China for a number of reasons. Like countries in the Middle East, it's an important supplier of energy. So that is, a very, very important factor to consider. Geopolitically, of course, I think Finighan also said something along the lines of, as long as there's turbulence in the world, the Russia-China relationship will be a guarantor of global stability. I might have the words wrong, but I think roughly the intent is that. So, and I think from the Chinese view then, it is that as long as there are problems, threats in the world, that the ability of China and Russia, and perhaps other countries as well, to work together to ensure a prosperous and stable global environment is vital.
Shirley, this rivalry then with the US that you talked about, this competition, this desire to win the competition, how much is that rivalry hurting China's economy right now? Is President Xi actually interested in repairing or at least thawing a little the relationship between China and the US?
I think the series of escalations of the US sanctions, particularly on Chinese technology, has made China double down on its efforts and existing practices. And so this time in the congressional session, you heard Mr. Xi personally inquiring private companies, where is the chip made in your machinery? And so this whole Chinese domestic economic challenges primarily arise today acutely from the financial sector and the technology sector. And of course, China has restructured, as Andy has alluded to, this whole new state-led whole of government architecture in order to seek technological self-reliance. But today, technology and the capital market, the financial sector goes hand in hand. And so we saw recent very aggressive investigations, anti-corruption investigations in the financial services sector, but also China just recently implemented the nationwide registration-based IPO system. And so once that system is in place, which is very much akin to NASDAQ or US kind of capital markets, then the Chinese rising technology companies will be able to seek financing from the domestic stock market in order to finance its sustainable rise. And so this finance and technology rise goes hand in hand. And he's not in hope at any day, I don't think, that Mr. Xi will wake up and say the US would start to supply us chips again.
Why though, is Xi extending his oversight, his personal oversight of the financial sector and the tech industry? He's replaced China's banking watchdog, and he's set up this new agency. This also the Science Commission that he's begun as well. Why?
Mr. Xi had set up many special executive committees to oversee various strategic sectors within the Chinese economy, and that you may call it's part of this whole Chinese structural transition of power from the government to the party, and essentially back to Mr. Xi himself. And I think that trend is going to continue. And now the Supervisory Financial Committee that's newly set up, it's going to replace the existing functions from China's banking watchdog and the insurance watchdog and some of the other functionaries within across different ministries. And so that sort of restructuring is actually a helpful sign, because when you have a lot of government entities that have cross functions of each other's, and then there are various regulators regulating essentially the same thing, that doesn't bring efficiency in terms of governance or transparency. And so now the new entity is likely to resolve some of that.
Adrian, let's discuss China's relations with the EU at the moment, where, as we said at the beginning of the program, tension persists over China's stance on Russia and Ukraine. To what extent is the EU seen as just a puppet of the US in China?
Yeah, that's a kind of contradiction, because on the one hand, China tries to divide the EU and the US. I mean, we have just seen this at the Munich Security Conference, where the China attacked the United States and said Europe should be more independent and should be more in the middle between the two sides and not together with the US. But on the other hand, in the context of the Ukraine war, I mean, China sees the Europe very much, of course, in one front with the US. And that brings me back to your earlier question. I mean, I had been a correspondent in Moscow also in the time 1990 until 1996, so the end of the Soviet Union and start of the new Russia. And Putin and Xi Jinping are united because they have the same world view. They both think that they had been humiliated by the West, especially United States, but in generally by the Western world as they see it. Putin brings this together with a breakdown, fall down of the Soviet Union, which is kind of ridiculous because I witnessed the fall down of the Soviet Union, and this was because of the internal problems of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries, not because of any foreign interference primarily. And Xi Jinping, as we know, sees it even in the much bigger context, the colonial time and the humiliation of China in that time, and wants to make China a big power again, which is a fair aim to make China in the most time of its history had been an important country culturally, economically, and so on. So it's fair to go back to this idea to make China a great country, but I think that confrontation for both sides is not helpful to develop this.
Andy, what's President Xi's standing with the Chinese public? His reputation did suffer, at least with some sections of Chinese society, after zero COVID, and then there was the rushed abandonment of zero COVID. There's the property crisis, the tech crackdown, there's high youth unemployment. Is he admired by the public, respected, liked by the Chinese public? Does it even matter?
Well, I think it certainly matters. No country, no regime can survive without public support. Punitive measures only work to a limited point and provoke backlashes eventually. And I would be careful maybe to distinguish. There certainly was a lot of dissatisfaction, concern, anxiety, even anger during the COVID lockdown period. Certainly some people did not feel the relaxation measures went well. But I think overall, there is enormous support for President Xi across all sectors of society, not just Xi, but the Communist Party as well. I think people recognize, too, that things can be better. And this is one of the reasons that I think we see the institutional reform going on today as well. Shirley made a great point that overlapping jurisdiction is inefficient. It creates cost and burdens for firms in the financial service sector, but it also creates problems in terms of regulatory arbitrage as well, where companies, financial service companies, can play off one regulator against another. So I think one of the unique features of the Chinese system is that it is able to engage in some regular, fairly significant institutional reforms. And I think, many people that have worked in large bureaucracies know just how difficult, if not impossible, that can be.
I'm sorry to cut you off there, but we're out of time. Many thanks indeed to all of you for being with us. Andy Mock, Shirley Yu, and Adrian Geiges. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the program again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.